There's a brilliant book about genius. It's called The Price of Greatness. And I think that is key to our understanding of genius. We always feel that greatness has a price.
Het genie, Napoleon, Van Gogh, Einstein, Da Vinci, Michiel de Ruiter. Mannen die de geschiedenis vormden, de wereld veroverden, veranderden en verder brachten.
We settled 8 wars and I think a 9th to come.
Zonder hen geen vooruitgang.
Well, that's the great man theory of history, right? Which is the idea that things move forward essentially because of one incredible individual. But when you have a story that is that powerful, then that power can be used in kind of bad ways too. In its extreme manifestations, it's about saying some people are so brilliant and so wonderful, they should be allowed to do pretty much whatever they want. And it doesn't matter what effect they have on the people around them. You have to just let these people do whatever they want.
We have a new star. A star is born, Elon.
En eenmaal opgeklommen tot deze status kan een genie straffeloos zijn goddelijke gang gaan. Aanbidden blijven we hem toch wel.
He's a special guy, he's a super genius. We have to protect our geniuses. We don't have that many of them.
Hoe schadelijk het label is, lijken we als gewone sterveling niet zo door te hebben.
It's a very important act, the Genius Act. They named it after me and I want to thank you.
Gelukkig is daar Helen Lewis. De Atlantic-journalist rekent af met heldentypes als Musk, Zuckerberg en Trump en waarschuwt voor the evil genius.
Well, I think what happens often is that it distorts our view of achievement. And very often it's about who's got the most compelling story. And quite often, again, the person who ends up being called the genius is the person who's got the best marketing, which is really difficult, I think. Is it trying to separate out true achievement from somebody who's best at selling themselves as a product is often very hard. And that is a story about the way that capitalism has shaped our society perhaps into ways that are more winner takes all, which is not really healthy. Like, I would prefer to have more people doing things that they love and a kind of more rich ecosystem rather than a couple of really tall trees that, whose canopy shades everything else. What's interesting about this to me is the fact that you can see so many of the tropes of heroic portraiture in all of these, right? Which is the kind of noble gaze off into the distance as if you're having a particularly big thought. He's a kind of exemplar, I guess, of a very 1980s kind of genius, which is just the kind of bullying salesman. He looks like he's going to buy that ship and possibly knock down this Roman forum and turn it into the Trump-branded forum. So Elon Musk, I would say, is the archetype of the kind of tech bro who is too busy and important to be nice to you. And this is kind of a fascinating thing, I think, which is that the fact that you really essentially the rudeness or the lack of interpersonal skills is rewritten as evidence of greatness. He simply is too busy having big thoughts about rockets to send anything other than like a poop emoji back to you in emails.
So when everybody leaves, it's just Elon sitting at home, brushing his teeth, just a bunch of ideas bouncing around your head.
Yeah, all the time.
When did you realize that that's not the case with most people?
I think when I was, 5 or 6 or something. I thought I was insane.
Why'd you think you were insane?
Because it was clear that other people did not. Their mind wasn't exploding with ideas all the time.
They weren't expressing it. They weren't talking about it all the time. And you realized by the time you were 5 or 6, like, oh, they're probably not even getting this thing that I'm getting.
No. It was just strange. It was like, I'm strange.
As humans, we love stories. A person did a thing, and that's how history works. Because, in the sense of mythology, like Greek mythology, it's a set of stories about how we understand the world. And it's not reality. It's reality curved into a method that's palatable, that appeals to us. I think stories undergo a form of evolution by natural selection. And I write about this in the book. They go through... when you hear the story of Picasso, it gets told and retold and retold, and it kind of achieves its final perfect form in the form that is most satisfying to us. And so, the people who get hailed as geniuses, they very often have a kind of caricature of themselves that becomes famous. Anyone who becomes famous will tell you that it's quite a bruising experience to find out that there's just a weird, shaved off version of yourself walking around out there that people have strong opinions on. But that definitely happens to genius. We boil geniuses down to a few kind of key essentials, and that's the mythology. And there are particular types of people who are more likely to be called genius. Let's not beat around the bush. It's more likely to be white men. That's not necessarily a problem, but it means that if you are a woman who achieves enormous things, if you are African American, if you are Jewish, if you are Asian, then actually sometimes you find yourself not getting that label. And it's nothing to do with you or your achievement. It's about our kind of cultural ideas about what a hero should be. We've all probably said the word genius, described someone as a genius casually at least once in the last week. But, what do we actually mean by it? And how has that word changed over time? So I tried to first of all take a historical look and say, well, the really interesting thing is that to the Greeks and Romans, genius was something that you had. It wasn't something you were. You had a genius that spoke through you. And that's really, in the early Christian Europe, a similar version of that would have held too, right? If you built a great cathedral in the 1200s, it wasn't about your incredible achievement. It was about God working through you. And it's really when you get to the Renaissance and then later to the Enlightenment, the 18th century and the kind of growth of secularism, that people become more comfortable with this idea that there are little gods, quasi-divine beings that walk among us. So you can in some ways say that the genius replaced God in Europe and in America.
God was protecting me. Maybe because God wanted to see our country do better or do really well, make America great again. But God was protecting me, Brian. I'll tell you, it's the more you think about it, the more you see it. I am the chosen one. Somebody had to do it. So I'm taking on China. I'm taking on China on trade. And you know what? We're winning.
And I am the only one that can save this nation because they're not coming after me, they're coming after you, and I just happen to be standing in their way, and I will never be moving. I think God is very proud of the job I've done, and that includes for religion.
I got into trouble for saying that genius is a right-wing concept. Because it's about the individual, right? And if you think about where the economic right of argument has been over the last couple of decades, it's about unleashing entrepreneurs, innovation, letting people, not taxing them too much so that they can fulfill their destiny.
Would you close our conversation by reading this excerpt from your essay, The Techno-Optimist Manifesto?
Love to. We believe America and her allies should be strong and not weak. Economic, cultural, and military strength flow from technological strength. A technologically strong America is a force for good in a dangerous world. We believe in greatness. We believe in adventure, undertaking the hero's journey, rebelling against the status quo, mapping uncharted territory, conquering dragons, and bringing home the spoils for our community.
And the left has emphasised more equality, giving everybody a fair chance, maybe not making such a big difference between the top and the bottom of society. And genius is quite challenging to that. And every example I've given there gives you an idea of what we're looking for in the genius myth, which is something bittersweet, a sense of struggle. You get something, but something is taken from you, something is withheld from you.
En wat blijkt, hoe groter de opoffering, hoe groter het voetstuk. Maar wie we bejubelen als superheld, zegt volgens Lewis vooral een heleboel over ons als maatschappij.
This is a pretty huge pedestal, and that is Horatio Nelson, England's great naval hero. Nelson's column was built to celebrate his victory over the French and the Spanish at the Battle of Trafalgar, at which he also was killed. And in the last couple of years, we've had all these arguments about statues, and they're kind of part of the argument about geniuses too, because it's about who do we celebrate, and do we still celebrate the same people that we did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Actually, one of the things that's great about being here is just around the corner behind me, you can't see it, there's one of the very few statues of a named woman, Edith Cavell, a nurse during the First World War. And actually one of the things you can see, we talk about genius being very male, statues are very male too. They represent a very male type of achievement. And that's why they're subject to many of the same debates that we have over geniuses. So I'm taking you to see Edith Cavell, who was a nurse during the First World War. And I think this is interesting about what Edith Cavell's being celebrated for. She was a nurse who treated both Allied soldiers, German soldiers, equally and was executed by firing squad. And when she died, she said, "I bear no ill will against anyone else." So she's being celebrated for a kind of very feminine set of qualities, which is a bit different to what Nelson is being celebrated for, the kind of more male genius, the military genius. The whole point of putting up a statue is to have an argument about what you value and what you as a country and a society value. And that's exactly the same reason that we appoint someone to be a genius. What do we value? In Edith Cavell, we value sacrifice and duty and a type of patriotism that she said it's not enough to have patriotism, you also have to kind of have love for everybody. That's a specific set of ideals that are being celebrated here. And that's the same thing that happens when we pick a genius. One of the other things that's interesting about having public art of somebody who talked about patriotism not being enough and died in the First World War is that you quite often see anti-war protesters around here or people protesting around war crimes. And statues are a kind of focal point for those kind of discussions in exactly the same way that it mattered that Albert Einstein was very worried about the nuclear bomb, because there was a person that you could point to, a focus, a rallying point around which you could have this big argument. He's a genius, he's worried about this. That makes it okay for us to worry about it too. Edith Cavell shows the dark side of war, not the kind of glory and the patriotism of it. So she becomes a focal point for people to talk about things that they want to talk about. But it's interesting that she's posed in a very heroic way. It's a very like manly, bestriding pose. And again, that's why statues are part of the kind of iconography of genius. It's about, in the same way that portraits are, it's about presenting somebody as being grand. Why are statues big? Why are people so often on horseback? It's about saying that they are superhuman. They're different to us somehow. They're not like ordinary people. I think we love to hero worship. I think that's a pretty natural human impulse. And also to find out whether or not other people value the same things that we do. We don't value people who are quote unquote perfect. We value somebody who has made something of their life through struggle. Was Winston Churchill a genius? If you want to start a fight in a pub in Britain, that's a pretty good question to throw out there. To some people, Winston Churchill is unquestionably a genius. If you look at how he came to power, the Nazis were on the march, Britain was pursuing a policy of appeasement, and he was the person who came in and said, Britain fights on, Britain alone will stand against the Nazis. And therefore he's a national hero. But there are some checkered bits in the backstory too. He will, to lots of people, forever be associated with the Bengal famine, which left millions dead in his career as a kind of colonial overseer. And so people have these big debates. Which is the real Winston Churchill? Is he the genius who galvanised this nation to stand against the Nazis? Or is he the kind of feckless colonialist of the Bengal famine?
And maybe he's both.
And he's both. I mean, this is why we can always argue about geniuses, because he's both. I think there's a huge amount to be proud of Winston Churchill, but we don't need to airbrush out the bad bits of the biography too. In fact, they're more interesting because they're what makes him human, right? He's not just the guy on the pedestal, he was a real human being.
If you have a hero that you grow up and you worship them, it's a bit like the process where I think for teenagers, when they find out that their parents aren't kind of all-knowing, that there can often be this intense disappointment. But then hopefully you get to the adult stage where you think, it's quite hard to be a parent. They did their best, and you forgive them. And I think that's sort of the adult version of where you need to get to with hero worship, which is, I can accept that this person wasn't perfect. That doesn't affect the things that I admire about them or the things that they produced that I really like. I think of the Romantics, who came up with this idea of the tortured genius. There's a line, I think it's Byron, "We of the craft are all crazy." The idea that if you wanted to be a really good poet, what you absolutely couldn't be is a nice middle-class guy, have some lovely flowers, I'll write a poem. No, you had to be tortured, you had to be an alcoholic, you had to have tuberculosis, you had to be bisexual, you had to have these challenges and tensions in your life that kind of brought forth great art. You had to be miserable and unhappy, or the art didn't really count somehow.
Maar wat nou als je als aanstormend genie geen verhaal vol lijdenswegen hebt om de mythe te bevestigen? Dan zijn er gek genoeg altijd wel mensen die wegen voor je willen aanleggen. Immers, alles voor de mythe.
The stories of struggle, definitely, the stories of genius that stand out most. Mark Zuckerberg is an interesting example of the genius myth. I think if you look at biopics, they are really interesting as a way of understanding how genius myths get constructed. Because the Social Network both relies on Mark Zuckerberg, the loser, and Mark Zuckerberg versus these two, in the Winklevoss twins, blithe, bastions of privilege. These guys who are just from, who've just are handsome and tall and have got everything going for them. And he's the nerd and the outsider. And for a particular type of guy, at the time, that was the mythology of tech. The film, Aaron Sorkin's brilliant film, Social Network, directed by David Fincher, is really interesting because it makes one very big change to Mark Zuckerberg's life, which is that in real life, he started dating Priscilla Chan, his wife of now 20 years, at college. By all accounts, very happy they've got 3 kids together. The book makes him a single loser. And that's really interesting to me, that they would think that that story is, let's make the creation of this incredibly big website and social network platforming about one guy's quest to make girls like him.
I need to do something substantial in order to get the attention of the clubs.
Why?
Because they're exclusive and fun, and they lead to a better life.
People want to go on the internet and check out their friends, so why not build a website that offers that? Friends, pictures, profiles.
I'm talking about taking the entire social experience of college and putting it online.
And it turns out he got a girl to like him. That was not a problem. Yeah, he was with the same woman that he's been married to now for a long time when he was, during all this. This is not a guy who is driven by his resentment at not being able to get laid. But that was a very powerful genius myth of the nerd loser who gets his revenge on the world. And the tagline for that movie is, you can't get to whatever it was, 1 billion friends without making some enemies. So it was all about him being kind of opposed to the world. And if he's just a normal, regular guy who's not massively tortured, it doesn't really work. Of course, the good thing about Mark Zuckerberg is that with fame, he has had a chance to get more weird, and he's now obsessed with Roman emperors and has named all of his daughters after various Roman emperors. And which is the kind of thing that I think that's what being called a genius does to you. You go, let's call my kids after Roman emperors. The bit where I think it's dangerous is the bit where we say that people who aren't weird, therefore aren't geniuses. The idea that if you're well-adjusted, it's boring. And I think that's a kind of fetishization of oddness, which doesn't necessarily help the odd people themselves, that they have to be special in order to get the kind of pass for just being a bit different.
Trap er niet in, wil Lewis maar zeggen, in dat met zorg opgetuigde, maar zo bedriegelijke beeld van een genie. Want, stelt ze, hoe meer mensen erin trappen, hoe groter de invloedssfeer. En daarin schuilt het gevaar. Trump start oorlogen wanneer hem dat pleziert. En Musk bepaalt met zijn Starlink-satellietspierballen in toenemende mate wie die oorlogen wint. En dat zijn dan nog genieën die een keer doodgaan. Dat is bij AI wel anders.
I think what's interesting about the AI companies is the way that they often talk about their models. They talk about them as geniuses, which is really interesting. One of the things that's not necessarily surprised me, but I think has been very obvious, is that people treat ChatGPT or Claude or whatever the name of the model is as a person. And actually, if you read the way that, say, people at Anthropic talk about Claude, which is their model, they do talk about it as this kind of quasi-divine being that they're kind of in the same room with. I think we have an innate tendency to anthropomorphize, to see things as human even when they're not. And I think that's something that I've definitely seen with AI models, both from the users and from the people who work with them, who know them most closely, right? You start off by giving something a name, and then before long you're worrying about hurting its feelings, which isn't a bad impulse at all. But I wonder if we're now treating them, do we treat ChatGPT as a genius, essentially? So much of our lives is now about our relationship with computers and computing power, that either some people pride themselves on thinking like computers, or we're interested in computers trying to be human. If the two futures are everybody talking to their AI and forming kind of cults to worship them as gods, or people go to the park and hang out with their friends, or go to, a concert hall and listen to music again, one of those futures seems a lot more utopian than the other one. I think instead of us trying to find a new archetype of genius, I'd probably be happier if we could broaden out the ways that we talk about achievement to talk about the genius of groups and teams. I mean, as I'm saying that, it sounds phenomenally boring. It's going to be quite the challenge. I keep thinking if they were in a band, who would be on what instrument? I feel like Elon on drums, Van Gogh on bass, lead singer, obviously, otherwise he'd make a fuss. And then, lead guitar, Mark Zuckerberg. The greatest supergroup we never had.